Every day, the Prime Minister has to lead 4.5 million people. It's his job to make the tough decisions and with the support of his cabinet. He needs to be accountable for any government policy if the media comes calling. He's the most important person in the country. So here today, to present to you about leadership, please stand and put your hands together to welcome Prime Minister John Key.
Thanks very much. Grab a seat, honestly. That's most kind of you. Yeah, sometimes I think I'm responsible for the weather, the All Blacks, and everything else as well, so don't worry about it. I know what it's like. Anyway, let me start. I think we might talk about a few things in different sort of groupings, and then you can ask me questions on anything you like. So I guess start by saying I have a lot of respect for engineers. I worked for Merrill Lynch for a long time when I was overseas. And we used to hire a lot of engineers, believe it or not. There's a lot of engineers working in investment banking because you're obviously analytical. So we used to get a lot of them working for us. So we see heaps of them doing amazing things, actually, a long way away from building buildings or designing stuff like that. So I suppose just starting on leadership, I mean, I've had a number of kind of leadership roles. So when I was in the private sector, for a long time I ran Treasury at Bankers Trust in New Zealand. I was there for about nearly 10 years. And then for 10 years I was at Merrill Lynch, really. So I basically started in Singapore, and then I was in London running the only global business Merrill Lynch had outside of the United States, New York. So London's natural home of foreign exchange. So I ran global foreign exchange. And I also later on ran their derivatives business and their sort of complex options businesses, really. So I had this sort of global role and this sort of local role, really. And then I came back to Australia for a year with Merrill, and then came back to New Zealand to run for politics. So that's sort of really been the upshot of that. So it was quite interesting, actually, just going to London when I was with Merrill. I actually went out to Singapore, as I said, and I was there for about 3 months. And I'd been Merrill Lynch, if you know anything about them, they're Bank of America these days. But anyway, cut a long story short, they were back in those days. They weren't very good at foreign exchange. Actually, they were quite weak, and yet they had this amazing global sort of customer base. So they should have been way better than they were. And so I went there, and I'd been there for about 3 or 4 months. And I don't exactly know how it happened, but the guy that was running foreign exchange at that point out of London, they fired him, decided that wasn't working. And there was this mad Australian who's actually now running ANZ, so he's not too mad. But anyway, called Steve Bellotti, he's quite a good mate of mine. But he came down to Singapore. I didn't know him at the time. And he said to me, okay, you've been here for 3 or 4 months, what do you think? And I said, do you want me to be polite or do you want me to be honest? He said, be honest. I said, this place sucks. It's so bad I'm thinking about going back to New Zealand. And he said, why? And I said, well, there's about 10 things that were wrong. And he said, I'll tell you what, if you're so smart, I'll send you to London to run global foreign exchange. And I went, oh, wow, that's cool. And he goes, yeah, if you don't make it after 12 months, I'll sack you. And I said, don't worry, if I don't make it after 11 months, I'll quit. So first lesson of leadership was always know when to get out, on top, hopefully. But anyway, as it turned out, we sort of went from strength to strength. And one of the things that happened at Merrill when we went there, it gets a bit technical, but we weren't what was called an intermarket maker. So we had lots of clients, and those clients might be, say, IBM or Boeing or something, and they would do a huge amount of business with Merrill Lynch. So, for instance, we were the largest underwriter of bonds and commercial paper in the world, one of the largest stockbrokers in the world. So say you're Boeing and you're running Boeing's treasury and you go along and you decide you're going to go and raise, I don't know, $2 billion in Swiss francs. Merrill had the biggest placement capability in the world to get rid of that paper, so we could just underwrite anything. The crazy thing about it was we just never really asked for the foreign exchange deal. So they were quite good at cross-selling themselves everywhere, but not in foreign exchange. And so I decided, well, if you don't make a market in these things, you can't clear that risk. And I'd always come from banks like Bankers Trust that had done that. They'd made these markets. And so the investment banks, the really blue blood ones, Merrill, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, those guys, they had never made prices. So when I got to London, I just said to our guys, well, this has all got to change. We're going to go and hire all these traders. We're going to go into bank. We're going to do all this stuff, which was sort of seen as being, we just saw ourselves as a bit elitist, I think, that we didn't actually have to go and make markets and do stuff. And as it turned out, I remember going out for lunch with the guy who now runs Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, and I said to him, well, we're going to go interbank and we're going to do that in a couple of weeks' time, and you guys should come with us. And we had this, really long discussion over lunch where he said, no, we're never going to do that. And anyway, I said, oh, well, fair enough, well, we are, and, see you later. And so cut a long story short on that one, we basically went and did that, and within 2 years, Merrill went from basically being number 53 on Euro money to number 3 in the world for foreign exchange. So the first year I was there, they, believe it or not, which for Merrill is like making nothing, we made 155 million that year, and 2 years later we made $1 billion, and they never made less than $1 billion after that. So it was quite an impressive turnaround for them, and it just sort of showed you, if you want to do different things, you certainly can get results. So I guess over the years, and it's been certainly true in politics, the main things I've really learned are, one, you have to have a sense of what you're trying to achieve. I mean, what on earth does success look like? So people ask me all the time. Muldoon, they famously once interviewed him and said, how do you want to leave New Zealand? And he said, in no worse shape than I found it. And I thought, God, that's hopelessly unambitious, So I would say to people, I want to leave New Zealand in better shape than I found it. And it's highly subjective. Some people will say I have, and some people will certainly say I haven't. And that'll be for a variety of different reasons. But you've got to have a sense of what it is you think is important and what you think you can do well at. And for us as a government, it's been very economically focused. So, as you may have seen, if you saw it, we've got our numbers for the 10-month accounts came out two days ago, and believe it or not, 3 weeks ago, the Treasury told us we were going to be 650 million in deficit, and turns out we're 450 million in surplus, so they're doing a great job down there. We've just really tried to get to saying, okay, make New Zealand grow, make New Zealand do well, make it economically stronger. Why? Because we fundamentally believe that people don't want to be dependent on the state. We do believe that the private sector has got a big role to play and can be successful. And so we've done a lot of things that you would think would be politically really difficult to achieve, and yet they've delivered great results and people have backed us. So, to give you one example, for 5 years we spent no extra money pretty much in every budget. So we just had zero budget. So every budget, you might sort of remember the way I used to get up and say, well, we're not spending any more money. We'd spend more money in health and education and science, but we'd do that by cutting other things. And we always thought the public would say, oh, I don't know if I really love all that. But I think in a lot of ways we aligned with what they were doing in their own houses, because in their own homes they were basically sitting there going, look, global financial crisis, all these things going wrong, got to get within, live within your means. So when I sort of say you've got to know where you want to go, what does success look like? And one of the things that will get no coverage, but at least I'll know it, and it's important to me, is that when we first came in the back end of 2008, the Treasury came over and said, here are all these programs you've got from the previous government. None of them have funding. All of them are exponentially expensive. They're going to cost you a fortune if you don't change anything. This is what your numbers look like. And one of the numbers they came out with was, they said by about 2018, New Zealand's debt will be at this level, right? So, okay, so it was 60% of GDP. So we were coming off relatively low base at that point, but 60% of GDP. So anyway, when they came over for budget 2013, so it's a couple ago now, they came over and said, we really love your numbers now. Everything's back in control, blah, blah, blah. Everything's sort of, you're getting back to surplus, all this stuff's happening. So I said, okay, what do you think our net debt numbers will be by 2018? So at that point, they said just under 30% of GDP. So they're now actually 26.3% of GDP. Well, they're 25. They think they'll top out at 26.3, but they might be slightly less than that. So the interesting question is, okay, so we are now 3 years from that date, not very far. How much less debt do we have as a result of the changes we've made? The answer is $100 billion. So we have saved $100 billion in 7 years of me being Prime Minister. And in the end, actually, it's not really me that's going to pay that bill. It's actually you guys. Because, for the bulk of it, most of you are young and you're going to be working a long period of time. And it's debt that the country would actually owe. It's an interesting psyche, by the way, on how we measure things. In New Zealand, our Treasury takes the hardest, coldest, meanest view I can find, and in Australia they do the complete opposite. Okay, so just to give you an example, the way they measure net debt, we're like I say 25% of GDP. Australia is 12%, right? So I said to Bill English a while ago, wow, it's amazing Australia's 12%, but I guess they came off John Howard, who was great Prime Minister in my view, had left them with zero debt, so I suppose that makes sense. He said, no, we don't think so. We can't work out how they've done that. So we sent some of the Treasury boffins over to go and have a look at how they were doing it. And turns out it's feels either slightly dodgy or not quite sure, but if you go and rework the same methodology of Australia's Treasury and put it over the New Zealand accounts, New Zealand's net debt would be 8% of GDP, and theirs is 12. So I said to them, how on earth have they done that? And they go, oh, we just forget about a whole bunch of things we're not sure they're going to occur. It's a really nice system, you know? So it's true in GDP growth too. So we're growing at about 3.1% a year, a little bit more than that. We've had higher growth than pretty much any other OECD country. You know, at the most part, we're growing very strongly. Again, in Australia, they say, look, we know the black economy's out there. We know lots of people do things for cash. So they just count about a third of the estimate of what the grey economy looks like. We don't count it at all, even though we know there are plenty of plumbers out there doing things for cash. So they take the best scenario, we take the worst scenario of everything you can find. It's kind of an interesting psyche, anyway. So, but anyway, the first thing I reckon you got to say is, what are you actually trying to achieve? So I always kind of think in my mind, I want New Zealand to be economically stronger, vibrant, self-sufficient, able to basically succeed on a world stage. And I think it doesn't matter what job you're doing. It's just having that sense of what would success actually look like. The second thing I think is get the best people you can around you. So really strong leaders have great teams and really weak leaders have poor teams. Because really weak leaders feel threatened that somehow along the line someone's going to come along and take them out or whatever and blah, blah, blah. Whereas it's, I reckon, the complete opposite. So I've had some of the most talented people working for me, both in the private sector and actually now in government, and a really stable team for a long period of time. But you've either got to take two styles of leadership. One is you say, I'm going to do everything myself and I'm going to completely micromanage everything. That's Helen Clark. Okay, I actually like her. I'm not being offensive. She just had a micromanaging view. So what happened with Helen was she had her chief of staff was a woman called Heather Simpson. So they used to call them H1 and H2, and nothing happened unless H1 and H2 signed off on it. I mean nothing. So you're the minister of sort of Veterans Affairs issuing a press release on whether some medal was going to be in what colour ribbon. Helen would decide whether the press release went out. So when you talk to the officials at work, they just said it was a logjam like you cannot believe, because no one single person can run the country and do all this stuff. Whereas I'd be lucky if I knew where the bill was actually in the country, let alone whatever's going on. It's a very hands-off style of management. And sometimes it can come and bite you because weird stuff happens. You go, it's probably a bit not the cleverest thing or whatever it might be. But overall, it's a very, very decentralised form of leadership. So, obviously we have in a management team, we have a sort of kitchen cabinet, we do all that stuff, but I just trust them to get on with it. But this is the only thing is, if I don't trust you, I don't want you anywhere near me. So I've had people in the private sector, I just got rid of them. It's a bit more difficult in politics, but anyway, it's a nice idea. But I just don't have them anywhere near me. And it won't always be for necessarily the soundest reasons. I mean, if I just don't think I can trust you, then I'm just not interested in having you around me. I don't want to spend my life second-guessing it. And I've had quite a few people who worked for me, and there are some people I've just never promoted to cabinet, and I'm never going to. They've either done something and it's subsequently proved to be that they're lying to me, or I think they're lying to me, or life's too short for me to worry about that stuff. So if you want to work alongside me, that's great. I'm going to give you all the rope in the world, but I'm not going to spend my life working out whether you're being honest with me. So I think that's the second thing, get a really, really good team. Third thing I reckon is be predictable. So, I have a pretty calm personality. I hardly ever throw my toys or all that sort of stuff. And so people know that with me. They know that I'm going to get up in the morning, it's going to be pretty like that, and it's going to be fine. Doesn't mean that obviously everybody gets upset by things, everybody has different emphasis, but they know what I'm likely to expect and they know how I'm likely to react. It's when people are really volatile. Once in the early days worked for a guy who was kind of, I don't know if he was bipolar or just mad, but you just had no idea what was happening next. It was impossible to work for someone like that. You know, you just have no idea what they're going to do to you next. So basically, my view is, you know, just try and be predictable in what you expect of people. And I think the last thing is sort of celebrate successes along the way. You know, I sort of think that, you know, we spend a lot of time, and it's easy in politics. You know, if you read the paper or you watch TV or whatever, you know, you get the razor blades out most nights. I mean, it's pretty horrendous stuff. But actually, we know kind of what's really going on, and I think the public does as well. So for the most part, I just don't worry about that stuff. I just say, okay, look, this is where we're going. This is what we're trying to achieve. And if we do something that we think is working well, then we pretty much stick with that. So that's sort of really been the main thing. I think people's capacity to absorb a lot is unbelievable, as Christchurch has demonstrated. You know, so you think about what Christchurch had to go through in terms of the earthquakes and all the post stuff. It is amazingly strong. But you know, I don't know. I also think myself. I mean, everyone's built a bit different, but I always wanted to be Prime Minister. So when I was 11, I wanted to be Prime Minister. So if I go to a primary school and say, put up your hand if you want to be Prime Minister, half of them put up their hand, you know? And that's cool, you know. But in reality, by the time they get to, 40, they're probably not going to put up their hand. But, you know, and your motivations do change. So when I was 11, I wanted to be Prime Minister. When I was 40, I wanted to be Prime Minister. So your motivation's a bit different, obviously. But I just never wanted to die wondering. I just thought, I think I can do it. I want to do it. So I just thought I'm going to give it a go. And it was quite a funny story when I ran for selection. It's a convoluted system running for selection in any democracy. But anyway, for the National Party, the way it works is we vote by delegates. So the head office never gets involved. So we've had challenges since I've fundamentally been there, but we just never get involved. So I stood for the seat of Helensville. At the time, I challenged the sitting MP. As it turned out, I was only the fourth person in Nationals history, which is now 79 years, that had won on a challenge. And the way that works is you have to have a certain number of delegates, and it's broadly minimum 60. So head office was really saying to me, oh, well, we think you'll do a way better job than the current MP, and so you should challenge them. And I never asked the obvious question, like, how unusual is that and how hard is that? They were pretty simple questions to ask. But anyway, I just thought, oh, they want me to do it. I want to do it. I'd come back from London. I'd retired from investment banking to go and run for politics. So I just assumed it'll all sort of fall into place. Small technical issue. They didn't tell me that the sitting MP has the right to choose the delegates. So if you've got half a brain, you just choose 31 family and friends, and you're never going to lose, are you? And so they didn't tell me that bit until I'd said I'm going to challenge him. And so what ended up happening was he did exactly that, the incumbent MP. So I started running this campaign, and the campaign lasted 6 weeks. Anyway, we were through this thing, and we're about halfway. I wrote to everybody and started trying to go and see every delegate and all this stuff. So I literally spent, it was a full-time job. I was basically trying to win the selection. So of the 60 people I wrote to, I think it was 22 of them, when I contacted them, said words to the effect of, I'll never meet you, I'll never vote for you, and I hope you rot in hell. Little things like that. And by the way, I hope it's a really painful death. But whatever happens, I'm just no interest in even talking to you, mate. Go away, never speak to me again, never send me anything. I'm not voting for you. So anyway, we said, okay, great. So that left 38, and you can do the maths. You need 31 and 38, which are not great odds on anyone's book. So anyway, we started going around, and even the ones that were vaguely sort of slightly conducive to change, they weren't that conducive to change. So anyway, we carried on for a while. Anyway, about, 2 weeks before the vote, the other thing I didn't realise is the caucus really hate challenges because, of course, they feel really, really vulnerable that someone's going to do it to them. So they closed ranks as well. So I had a whole bunch of these MPs ringing me up saying, you should pull out, you're a really bright guy, come back in 2005, we'll organise a proper seat for you. And anyway, I started thinking, okay, well, maybe they're right. Then they said, okay, if you go through this challenge and you lose, you'll be losing, in their words, to one of the weaker MPs we've ever had. And so you'll really be a loser because you can't even beat the weakest MP we've got. So what hope have you got? At that point, I worked out about 12 people were going to vote for me. So I thought, oh, God, this is the beginning of the end. So anyway, by the weekend, I thought, oh, well, I might as well throw in the towel. I mean, this is clearly not going to work. So I said to my wife, oh, well, I'm going to pull the pin. And my wife is, she's a great little national voter, but she's not very political. She just said, oh, yeah, whatever. Yeah, whatever. We've just come all the way back from London. Yeah, okay, but okay. But she said, yeah, well, it sounds like you're going to lose. So fair enough. Wasn't that encouraging? And I went, oh, okay. So anyway, this guy who was a cabinet minister, remained nameless, but but it was out of the caucus. He rang me up on the Sunday night, and he said, I hear you're going to pull out tomorrow. I went, yep. He said, why is that? And I said, because 12 people are voting for me, 22 people want me to rot in hell, and the rest are never going to vote for me, so I'm kind of doomed. And by the way, I need 31. And he went, okay, well, that's good. I went, really? I went, okay. So I was just about to hang up, and he literally said to me, one small little issue. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. And he said, you do realise that if you pull out, you are a loser. And by the way, you're never going to make it, so don't even bother playing politics again. Don't believe all this nonsense. You'll come back in 3 years' time. Go and get yourself a decent job overseas, leave, and never come back. Because I'm telling you, if you can't fight for something, you're never going to be successful in politics. If you're going to run the first time there's a problem, you're not going to make it, and you might as well call it quits. So I sort of sat there, hung up, and thought, oh, well, he's got a point, really. I've come all the way back. I've wanted to do this since I was 11 years of age. I've retired from investment banking to do this. Am I really going to give up? And I thought, stuff it. I'm just going to give it a go and see if I can win. So we just redoubled efforts, went around to every person. Anyway, just to give you an example of what it's like, there was these quite young guys who were, like you, urban professionals, right? And you would have sat there and thought they'd vote for me because they were young. They had a bit of a sense of that we needed to do better. The party was polling really badly. You would have thought they would want some young blood in place. And so they had been a bit more supportive, but not enough to say they were voting for me. And they certainly weren't in the 12, who were a lot more supportive. Anyway, I just got this funny feeling on the Thursday night, we had the last meet the candidates, and the vote was on the Sunday on St. Patrick's Day. Anyway, one of the guys said to me, I want you to come to my office tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Right, I went, okay. And he said, don't be late, because if you're late, that's rude. And I went, okay. And he said, and don't be early, because I'm very busy. And I don't have time to waste on you. Come at 1 o'clock. And I thought, geez, where do we get these dickheads from? Right? Real honestly, really. I'm trying to think about this multi-billion-dollar business I used to run, and now I'm trying to work out whether I've exactly got Greenwich Mean Time of 1 o'clock. But anyway, so I listened to Radio New Zealand's news, listened to the birds singing at 1 o'clock, got out of the car, walked in, and these three guys were there, and they said, okay, we're going to vote for you, and as soon as you start talking nonsense, we're going to get rid of you. And so they had the vote on the Sunday, and we won 32-28. But it was an interesting kind of observation, I think, that if you really want something, you can get there. And I always say, we've just been out at St. Margaret's actually, earlier this morning, opening the new building, beautiful building, by the way. Don't know who did the numbers on it, but it looks really good. But I just sort of said to them, truthfully, the issue is, I reckon in life, success is very little to do with ability. It's far more to do with attitude. If you think you can succeed or you think you want to achieve something and you're prepared to work to do it, more often than not, you'll get there. So that was sort of really the kind of lessons of all that, I suppose. The only other thing I'd sort of say, if you think about all of that, as I said to you, it's interesting what's happening in New Zealand. People are living a lot longer. Like, everyone's living a lot longer. That's true around the developed world. So in New Zealand, the average woman dies at about 83 now, and the average man dies at 81. So I was telling them this morning, I get very nervous about saying that at rest homes because they don't know the difference between a cap and an average, and they all think they're going to cark it as soon as I tell them that. But anyway, it's not true. They can live beyond that, trust me. But what's happening is it's going up 2.7 years for every decade. So you think about it. If you're 30, then in sort of 70 years' time, it's going to have gone up, basically whatever it is, 15, 16, bit more years, bit more than that, 18 years basically. So the average woman, certainly for you guys, for most of you, you're going to live into your early 90s. Your kids are going to live to 100 on average. it's a hell of a long time to be on the planet doing either something you don't like or not, not trying to give it your best, really, I think. So I don't know. To me, I reckon that was where I wanted to be. And look, I don't know how long I'll last as Prime Minister. In the end, they could vote us out in a couple of years, or we could last longer. In the end, I always think it's not a longevity test. It's about what you achieve. But for me, it won't be about whether the Christchurch Press writes a nice editorial or an awful one about me or anything else. It's actually fundamentally comes down to I think I've done the best things that I can do in the circumstances that we've had. And I think if you look through everything from what we did, standing behind Christchurch right through to everything else, I think it's basically been pretty strong. So I'm comfortable. It doesn't mean you can't do better. I think in all things in life, you have to be realistic. Very, very little about life is perfection, really. And certainly politics is not. If you want perfection, politics is the wrong place to be. We never have perfect information. Things always change. There's a whole lot of stuff beyond our control. You just have to deal with the best situation you've got, but you've got to give it a go. Okay, so let me give you 5 minutes on why New Zealand's going pretty well. The answer is Christchurch and Auckland, really. So what's happening in New Zealand is quite a dramatic change being driven off a few major factors. One, Christchurch rebuild's huge, so $40 billion essentially being spent at one period of time. So it's a massive economic input. And interestingly enough, a lot of it's a foreign direct investment input, because we're putting in about $16.5 billion. So the rest of it is largely reinsurance. Not entirely, but largely reinsurance, and that's, of course, offshore flow. So you've got, and lots of you will be working on different projects depending on what sort of engineering you're doing, but some of you will be working on, we just come from Justice Precincts down the road or a million other things. You know how big those projects are. Any one of them would seem big. You're doing a hell of a lot of them in one period of time. It's equally true in Auckland. So what's happening in Auckland is there's an infrastructure deficit. So just to give you one idea, in downtown Auckland, I don't know how well you know it, but in downtown Auckland, it's a pretty big site there between Queen Street and Albert Street. The Chinese are just funded and are going to start building a 52-storey tower there. So it goes right up to the rim of the Sky Tower. They're building a 5-star hotel down at the old Team New Zealand base. The Sky City Convention Centre and hotels being built, $800 million. And just to stand still in Auckland with net population increase, we need to build 13,000 houses a year, and the run rate's been 4. So in 08, 9, 10, it was 4,000. So it's just a massive infrastructure deficit before you start doing anything else. Second big driver is net migration gain. So what's happening is we don't have necessarily a lot more people coming in, but very few people are leaving. So in 08, when I was leader of the opposition, we did this thing at the Cape Town in Wellington. We said, it was this commercial. We basically, equivalent to the stadium leaves for Australia every year. Now that number's basically zero. It's literally zero. So we have positive. In a couple of months this year, we have positive flow of more Australians coming over than New Zealanders going to Australia. So a very strong migration, half of which goes to Auckland, the rest of it goes around the country. Christchurch has been the same. So I remember after the earthquakes, people said, Christchurch population is going to collapse. Not true. Actually, it's been rising quite rapidly and doing very well. Second big driver is just the internationalisation. Well, really it's the wealth effect of Asia. And that is going to be huge. So, China's slowing down a wee bit at the moment. Probably had a bit of a perfect storm when it comes to dairy, build up of inventory. Essentially, they get a lot of foot and mouth in China in their dairy sector, and that hasn't been happening this year. You just had a whole lot of different things, displacement of product out of Europe, very good growing conditions around the world. But generally, China's got to grow at about 7% a year. And it's an amazing wealth effect, and it's not going to stop. And it's not just China. We went to, I hosted the Indian-New Zealand Business Summit in Auckland about a month and a half ago. So the head of the Indian Chamber of Commerce got up and said, just think about these stats. By 2025, so a decade from now, not very far, 28% of the world's population will be Indian. So 28% of the world's workforce will be Indian, and the average age will be 29. So just to give you an example, there's so many countries in Asia that we don't even talk much about that I just want to buy what New Zealand sells. So if you take protein, we produce a lot of food, obviously, and produce a lot of protein. So take Indonesia. Okay, so Indonesia is a country of 250 million people. The average age is 24 or less. So as you get wealthier, you eat more protein. That's what everybody around the world does. So the average Indonesian per capita, so per person per year, eats 2.4 kilos of beef. Okay, my son eats that on Saturday night, right? Okay, we eat 50 kilos in New Zealand. They're eating 2.4. Okay, so the average Kiwi eats basically a kilo of beef a week, and they eat 2.4 kilos a year. So as they get wealthier, they are buying a truckload of product, and that's just Indonesia, let alone everybody else. So there's this huge sort of wealth effect that's happening across Asia. Fourth thing I think that's happening is there's a real change actually in technology, science and innovation. So we spend $1.5 billion on science in New Zealand now. And a lot of you will know exactly what I'm talking about, depending on what sort of engineering you do. But I think it was yesterday, I was at Metro Glass in Auckland, opening their facility up there. So it's the most modern glass manufacturing plant in Australasia. So they've got some equipment out of Italy that's on a 3-year waiting list, but let alone everything else, the place is essentially run by robots. They still have 250 staff just in that operation alone, but they're doing a lot different things. And we see, so what's happened is, even though the exchange rate's been going up, coming down a little bit now, but all of those things, why have New Zealand companies been able to survive? It's because of all the smart things you guys do. It's basically redesigning. So one of the biggest things we've done is stop giving company grants. We hardly do that now. NZTE does a little bit, not very much. What we do is we roll out things like lean manufacturing, which is time and motion on steroids. We do better by design, all that sort of stuff. New Zealand is never going to make it on the world stage selling things on price. It can't do that. It's too far away. It costs too much. So generally, you've seen this huge improvement, basically, in the sort of know-how of New Zealand. So I think sometimes people say, the best years are behind New Zealand. That's absolute nonsense. The best years are ahead of New Zealand. If you just look at our numbers, so our growth numbers, our debt numbers, and our employment numbers, just to give you one example on those. If you look at employment numbers, there are 36 countries in the OECD. Only 4 of them have a higher rate of employment than us. 31 of them are below us. If you look at growth numbers and net debt numbers, we have stronger growth numbers predicted and lower debt numbers than Australia, the UK, the US, all of the Eurozone, and Canada. Any comparable country that you can think of with New Zealand. And we are going to have those right out till 2020 and beyond. So we sit there and thinking some of these countries are wealthy. Okay, the US, their debt to GDP numbers are 100% of GDP, so they owe $17 trillion. I mean, just the Iraq and Afghanistan and wars, the Afghan wars have cost them, I think, $3.1 trillion. Just those alone. I mean, they're huge, huge numbers. The UK owes 95% of GDP. It's massive. In Japan, they owe 220% of GDP. The only reason they're not going bankrupt, I mean, their debt's BBB, I think. It's really lowly rated. So the only reason they're not going bankrupt in Japan is that Japanese consumers, basically households, have been very large savers. And because they're so innately conservative, they lend this money to the Japanese government, even though they get 0 interest for it. In fact, it's negative return to put your money in the bank in Japan. So all these countries have very serious issues. Like, if you look at Australia, even Australia, which in a lot of respects you got to say is the lucky country, I mean, debt is rising pretty rapidly. Its deficit was $35 billion this year. We don't think there's any time in the next 5 to 7 years they're going to get back to surplus. Nowhere near it. Just to give you one simple example. Okay, if you look at participation rate, how much of the workforce is actually in employment, right? So it's 69.5% in New Zealand. In Australia, it's 62%. So our unemployment rate is 5.8%. It's a very technical thing, the way you measure unemployment. But if Australia had the same participation rate as we did, in other words, 69.5% of its population was in work, the Australian unemployment rate would be about 11%. So we have half the unemployment rate of Australia. And you think about young people. So I went to a cafe in Wellington, a few years ago, and it's just one simple example. But this girl came up to me, and anyway, she knew who I was, and she was sort of chatting away, and blah blah blah. And I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Oh, Spain." And I said, "How old are you?" And she said, 20. I said, "How long have you been here?" And she said, 7 months. And I said, "Yes, so you got 5 months to run, right?" She said, "Yep." I said, "You're on your 1-year working holiday program." She said, "Yep." And then she just burst into tears and said, "Don't send me home." And I went, "Okay." And she said, long involved story. And I said, well, okay. She said, well, if I go back to Spain, I'll never get another job again. And to a certain degree, she's right. So the youth unemployment rate, those between 15 and 25 in Spain, is 50%. 1 in 2 young people in Spain don't have a job. And they're not going to get one. They're not going to get one. So the systemic issues in Europe are, huge, I think. It doesn't mean that you can't go there and get a job. It doesn't mean we can't sell things to those markets, but it's just in a very different space.
First question then.
Okay.
So I'm Fritha, I'm the Engenerate Canterbury chair. My question is, what advice would you give someone going into a leadership position for the first time?
I reckon be yourself. People worry a lot about, I reckon if you look at Parliament, it's an interesting place, Parliament. So we have 59 MPs and we're all under the national banner. That's essentially the ticket. Every one of them's different. So when I was leader of the opposition, I spent ages looking at Helen Clark. I used to just look at what she did, analyse what she did, have a look at the decision-making process she went through. And I learnt lots of things probably, quietly out of watching that. But I'm not Helen Clark. I'm a long way away from Helen Clark, actually. So, and she's not me. And when you try and be somebody else, in the end you're a fraud, and people just go, I can see through that. It's like on TV. We always say on TV, TV looks through to your heart. If it's all going a bit shady and you're lying, they'll see that. If you're not, they'll see that. So I just reckon, if you're going into leadership, kind of go out there, as I said, have a sense of what you're trying to achieve, get some decent people, but basically most of all, kind of be yourself and just, in the end, people will back you or they won't, but don't be afraid of it.
I'm Tim Court-Patience from AECOM. My question for you, Mr. Prime Minister, is as a young boy, what inspired you to become the Prime Minister, and what was your continual motivator to change and become the leader of New Zealand?
The latter bit was, as I said to you earlier, I reckon your motivations, obviously dramatically change. When you're 10 or 11 years of age and you're watching TV and you see someone who's Prime Minister, where you think, it's pretty cool and they're doing all these things, or whatever it might be. When you're 40 and you're seriously thinking about giving up your career to do this as a second career, then your motivations have got to be that you believe you can make a difference. And I kind of, in real simple terms, thought, I want to make the news, I don't want to watch the news. I actually think New Zealand underperforms, and I reckon I can do a good job of making a difference for that. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't stay. Like I said, to me, it's not a longevity test. Success isn't that, I'm there for 9 years or 12 years or 15 years or whatever the number might be now. It's just whether I think I made a difference in that. In terms of the motivator, that by far, I was actually telling the girls at St Margaret, that kind of the very abridged version with my family is that my mother was an interesting woman. She's an Austrian Jewish refugee. So in 1938, when the Nazis invaded Austria, she was 16. Her aunt, who lived in England, married a British soldier, paid the guy to marry her, and got my mother and her brother out of Austria. And so she turned up in England, couldn't speak a word of English, all this sort of stuff. So she saw a lot of adversity in life because came from quite a well-to-do family. Her entire family went to the concentration camps. So there were basically no money. Came out to New Zealand, married Dad in the UK, came out. And when I was 6, Dad just had a massive heart attack and dropped down dead. So I have no memories of my father. I can't remember him at all in any meaningful way anyway. And so Mum had these businesses, went off to the accountant, said to the accountant, look, my husband's died, I've got all these businesses, don't know much about them. And the guy came back and said, look, the bad news is you're broke. The good news is I can probably get you out of it. Mum just said, I'll sell the businesses, sell the house. So that's why we came to Christchurch. So we just literally, Mum said, I've got to make a new life. Bought my sisters, came down here, grew up in Hollyford Ave, went to Aorangi, Cobham and Burnside High School. And the main thing I learnt with Mum is that 2 things I reckon. One is you get out of life what you put into it. So she was a huge motivating factor. She always used to say to me, I don't want excuses. I'm not interested in excuses. Just show me answers and prove you can do things. I'm not interested in you feeling sorry for yourself. I'm interested in you getting out there and doing some things. That was one thing. And I think there's no substitute for hard work. Like I just saw with her, her capacity actually just to pick up her own life, reshape things. Like she just worked like a dog. She worked like a cleaner. She worked as a cleaner. She eventually saved up some money. She got out of the state house. She built her own house. And I just think, like realistically, if you're unemployed in Christchurch today and you're prepared to do anything, do you reckon you can get a job? Like you're prepared to do anything? I reckon you can. And so, I mean, I'm not saying people aren't down their luck and they don't have various circumstances and things. You know, there's always stories that are difficult. But I reckon if you really want to, you can change your own life. And this comes back to what I sort of said earlier, I suppose. I just thought, look, she hugely motivated me to want to do things. She used to say, you know, you can kind of do anything, you can make anything of yourself. Just it's up to you, really. And you got to be prepared to work. You know, you got to be prepared to give it a go. And I just learnt that through her, I suppose. Yeah.
Nope.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So I think what's happening with climate change is, as an issue, it was really, when I first came in 2008, Copenhagen happened and it was, theoretically huge, but we were going to the global financial crisis and all these countries just philosophically said, whether we want to accept it or not, just said, we don't have the money, the impact on our economy is going to be large, and they didn't do anything, really. I mean, they can argue they did, but truthfully they didn't. We did a bit more, ETS and things, but fundamentally they didn't do anything. I reckon as an issue it's coming back, much more strongly, because my chief science advisor, Sir Peter Gluckman, is a very, very smart man, just got the Order of New Zealand actually in the Queen's Birthday Honours. I gave it to him and I think he's quite a brilliant guy, and he would say to you, if he was here now, he would say all the evidence supports that climate change is happening and happening more quickly, and that's the overwhelming bulk of scientific evidence. So I think myself, the challenge for New Zealand is our profile is so different. So half of all of New Zealand's emissions come from agriculture. And so if you think about it, for instance, the OECD average for electricity generation is 22% is renewable. We're 80%. So I reckon if you look at the big changes that will happen in New Zealand, 10 years from now, most of you will be driving electric cars, probably 5 years from now. So the price of those is going to collapse. The cost of running them is a tenth of running a normal car, and that's where we're going to go. We will end up 90, if not more, renewable, because we've got lots of geothermal, lots of wind capability, and still some hydro capability, and solar is improving and reducing in price. So my only basic point with climate change would be, I do think we have to do our bit. We chucked a ton of money into scientific research for methane nitrate emissions, but we're the most efficient producer of agriculture from an emissions perspective in the world. So shooting New Zealand animals and destocking doesn't make sense because someone else is going to start that up. I think it's got to be a global solution. And some people would say, okay, we should lead the world, but I tell you, a lot of the stats and that stuff is not that easy. Just to give you one example, the European countries are going to have a 40% emissions reduction target. That's what they'll take to Paris at the end of the year. The New Zealand Treasury's estimate of that is if we put the same cost on each consumer as they are putting on in Europe, our target would be plus 20%. And it's because they have very limited amount. The world average for agricultural output's 18%, and Europe would even be less than that, whereas we're 50%. So all I guess I'm sort of simply saying is our population's really rising, our economic growth has been faster, and our profile is different. But broadly, New Zealand's got to do more, and actually the world needs to do more. It's just a matter of how you work your way through that. And in the end, it does come back to China and India and probably the United States, really. Yeah. One more you say? Yeah. Apparently
looks like I've got the last one.
Throw me on a plane, apparently.
Matt Cameron, IPM's Canterbury branch chairman. Thanks for your presentation, very candid, which we appreciate. So I've got a question about engineers and leadership roles. Yep. So how do you perceive the role of engineers in society? Do you think that engineers should have more leadership roles in society? And if so, how do you think that can be done?
Yeah, okay, so I should probably declare that my best man was an engineer, well, he's not an engineer now, but he was an engineer. And he went to Canterbury University, actually, very bright guy. And I guess what I'd sort of say is, I think with engineers, my simple experience of being around them is that they're generally very mathematic and very kind of analytic in what they do and quite logical in a lot of cases. And I accept there's a whole lot of difference between civil engineering, mechanical engineering, robotic engineering, all those different things. But in principle, they're the same things. And so there are lots of engineers in New Zealand that are in leadership roles. There's plenty of the Keith Turners and lots of other engineers that are out there. And there's absolutely no reason, why they can't and wouldn't be very successful as leaders, and often they are. There's just less of them than, if you look at lawyers and accountants. I'm an accountant. There's half our parliament's full of lawyers. There's just a lot more of them, I think, really. But I think what they do is really important. And the second thing is that they, if you think about New Zealand, you go back to what I was saying earlier. In between engineering and science, there's New Zealand has to continue to move up the value curve, and it has to become more and more productive and efficient. I mean, we are the last bus stop on the planet. We're just a long way away from things. So, the concept of New Zealand actually being able to do things that we export that are low value is not going to work. And I'll tell you the interesting thing that I think is happening in the engineering space is that when I go overseas on these trade missions to all sorts of places, increasingly the people we're taking with us are actually service-based people like engineers. So there's a company actually in New Plymouth, and they do engineering work for the oil and gas sector. So I'll never forget going there. I went there one time, and they literally had, their staff was about 200. About 100 of them were PhD engineers. They just paid up to get these guys that were really, really good. So I was talking to this guy, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I run the division that looks after Australia, and we're design engineers, and we design all of the different valves and equipment for platforms like the Maui gas platform, but we do it in Australia." So I said, "Okay, how old are you?" And he said, "I'm 30. So I said, "Oh, it's quite young to be in that job, running all these people." And he goes, "Yeah." And I said to him, "How often do you go to Australia? You're there quite a bit." And he said, "Mate, I don't have a passport. I've never left New Zealand." I went, "What?" He goes, "I've never left New Zealand." I said, "How on earth do you do that?" He said, "I don't need to." He said, basically people walk around, they Skype what we're doing. Everything we do is in CAD 3D. I can understand all this stuff. I don't even need to go and look at it. And their entire business was essentially design work for offshore clients. Most of what, but by definition, they're all offshore, their clients, and some of it was for the local oil and gas sector. And it just shows you how the world is sort of changing. So I think if people want to be leaders, it just comes down to the personality. I mean, we've got people with a range of different things, and the cool thing in Parliament is everyone wants to be Prime Minister, so we've got 121 leaders there at the moment. But I just think it comes down to whether you kind of want to do it or not. In some industries, if you think about, I don't know, say Transpower, would you really want to run Transpower if the chief executive's not an engineer? You could do it, I suppose, if they're an accountant, but it would be quite risky for a business where there's massive capital investment and where it's very technical. But I think in lots of roles they can. As I said, the one thing I found at Merrill was that we didn't care about what someone's basically degree was in. All we cared was that they were analytic enough to understand what we were doing. So with the engineers, we usually threw them in the derivatives business. So they do, third generation derivatives. So if you do to do a third generation derivative is like this. So if you do a normal derivative, I'm going to buy a call option on the New Zealand dollar at 65 cents against the US. So if it goes above that, I exercise them. If it doesn't, I don't. A third generation derivative is when you say you have the right to exercise the option if the New Zealand dollar is above 70 cents at exactly the same time the sun is shining in Dunedin, and by the way, the All Blacks have won 4 test matches in a row, 3 completely uncorrelated events. So you can imagine pricing that risk. It is really, really challenging thing to do. And in our experience, the engineers and physicists were the best guys at understanding all that. Did a pretty good job. Anyway, thanks very much for having me here.
Well done. Congratulations. For me, 2 words. And you may mention one, you definitely didn't mention the other one. Courage and choice. Courage to lead and choose to lead. The Prime Minister said at the age of 11, you wanted to lead. He made a choice to lead, and he wasn't afraid to carry that choice out. All the way through your speech, you made choices in your life. And whether you want to be Prime Minister, or you want to lead the school PTA, or lead Engenerate, whatever it is, make that choice and get up there and lead. As New Zealanders, we are a country of leaders. You've chosen to be engineers, whatever discipline you are. You've chosen to be, hopefully, professional engineers, which will make the difference, will mean that there are some leaders in the future that will come out of this room. You made a couple of other choices that affected the outcome today. The Prime Minister chose to accept the invitation to come here. That was one big choice. The bigger one that will impact your future is he's chosen to be courageous about New Zealand's future. So rather than focusing on can he win the next election, and you talked about zero budgets, focusing on those, he's chosen to think about your future 10, 20, 30, 50 years hence. So that the people will benefit aren't me and some of the older people in the room. You will be the ones who will benefit from the choice that our Prime Minister has made. So please, put your hands together. Thank him for the choice to come today, but more importantly, the choice he's making for our future on your behalf. Thank you.